In the autumn of 1834, a dock worker at Baltimore's Inner Harbor made a discovery that would shake the foundations of American medical education forever. Hidden beneath layers of salt and ice in a European-bound cargo ship, he found 17 perfectly preserved human bodies, each bearing surgical incisions with the precision of a master anatomist. The shipping manifest listed them as medical specimens from St. Thomas Medical University in rural Maryland. But the dock worker recognized something far more disturbing. One of the bodies bore a distinctive scar he remembered from his own nephew, a young man who had supposedly died of fever while studying at the prestigious Catholic medical school. What authorities uncovered next would reveal a 36-year conspiracy of murder, greed, and betrayal that generated over $800,000 in blood money, a fortune that would equal nearly $25 million today. The Walsh family had turned their sacred institution into America's most profitable house of horrors, and the evidence lay rotting in the holds of ships bound for Europe's most prestigious universities. Before we continue with the story of the Walsh family and their sinister medical empire, I want you to know that this channel is dedicated to bringing you the most chilling true stories from America's dark past. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these exclusive tales. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? I love hearing from our community of mystery seekers across the country. Now, let's discover how a family of respected physicians became the architects of one of history's most elaborate murder schemes. The investigation that followed would expose not just the Walsh family's crimes, but an entire network of corruption that reached from the Catholic Church to the highest levels of European medical academia. St. Thomas Medical University stood like a beacon of Catholic learning in the rolling hills of western Maryland, some 40 miles from Baltimore. Founded in 1798 by the ambitious Dr. Michael Walsh, the institution had earned a reputation as one of America's finest medical schools. Specifically designed to train Catholic physicians who could serve the growing Irish and German immigrant populations flooding into the young nation. The 3-story brick building topped with a modest bell tower and cross-housed not only lecture halls and laboratories, but also a small chapel where students attended daily mass. Dr. Michael Walsh, the university's president, was a man of imposing presence. Standing well over 6 feet tall with piercing blue eyes and silver hair that he kept meticulously groomed, he commanded respect from both students and faculty. Born in County Cork, Ireland, Walsh had studied medicine at Trinity College Dublin, before immigrating to America in 1795 with grand visions of establishing a medical dynasty. His wife, Dr. Margaret Walsh, served as the university's dean, a remarkable position for a woman in an era when female physicians were almost unheard of. Margaret was equally brilliant, though her sharp features and cold demeanor often intimidated the young men under her care. She had received a medical training in Edinburgh, one of the few European institutions that would accept women, and her knowledge of anatomy was considered unparalleled in the New World. The third member of the Walsh triumvirate was Dr. James Walsh, Michael's younger brother, who served as the university's professor of anatomy. Where Michael was charismatic and Margaret was intimidating, James was methodical and precise. His anatomy lectures were legendary among students, not just for their thoroughness, but for the remarkable quality of the specimens he used. While other medical schools struggled with poorly preserved cadavers or resorted to grave robbing, St. Thomas somehow always had access to fresh, perfectly preserved bodies for dissection. The university attracted students from across the eastern United States, particularly young men from poor Irish and German Catholic families who saw medicine as their path to respectability and prosperity. These students, many of whom had worked grueling jobs to save money for their education, were drawn by the school's reputation and its promise of a degree that would open doors throughout Catholic America. The tuition was steep, nearly $200 per year when a liberal might earn only $300 annually. But the Walsh family offered a work-study program that allowed poorer students to assist in various university operations in exchange to reduce fees. What made St. Thomas particularly appealing was its emphasis on practical training. While other medical schools relied heavily on theoretical instruction, the Walsh family insisted that their students gain hands-on experience with human anatomy. The university's anatomy laboratory was a pride of the institution, featuring multiple dissection tables, the finest surgical instruments available, and what seemed like an endless supply of fresh cadavers. Students who graduated from St. Thomas were known throughout the medical community for their exceptional surgical skills and intimate knowledge of human anatomy. The surrounding community of Amitsburg had grown accustomed to the comings and goings of medical students and faculty. Local merchants prospered from the business the university brought, and many families took in students as boarders. The Walsh family had cultivated relationships with local Catholic parishes, and Dr. Michael Walsh often delivered sermons as a guest speaker, emphasizing the sacred nature of medical practice and the importance of serving God through healing the sick. However, beneath this veneer of respectability and Catholic piety, something far more sinister was taking root. The university's remarkable success in producing skilled physicians came at a price that no one in the surrounding community could have imagined. The Walsh family had discovered that their strategic location, just far enough from major cities to avoid scrutiny, but close enough to shipping routes to facilitate commerce, made them ideally positioned for an enterprise that would exploit the most vulnerable members of the academic community. The first signs that something was amiss at St. Thomas Medical University emerged in the spring of 1799, barely a year after the institution's founding. Patrick O'Brien, a 19-year-old from Boston whose family had scraped together every penny to send him to medical school, simply vanished during what should have been his final month of study. According to university records, Patrick had been struggling with his coursework and had volunteered for additional anatomy practice sessions with Dr. James Walsh to improve his grades before final examinations. The circumstances of Patrick's disappearance were peculiar from the start. His roommate, Thomas Mackenzie, later recalled that Patrick had seemed unusually nervous in the days leading up to his disappearance, mentioning strange noises coming from the anatomy laboratory at night, and expressing concerns about some of the special procedures that Dr. James Walsh had begun incorporating into his advanced courses. On the night of May 15, 1799, Patrick left his dormitory room at approximately 9 o'clock, telling Thomas he was going to the laboratory for a late-night study session. He never returned. When Thomas reported Patrick missing the following morning, Dr. Michael Walsh personally handled the inquiry. He explained that Patrick had indeed come to the laboratory, but had become overwhelmed by the pressure of his studies and the graphic nature of the anatomical work. According to Walsh, Patrick had suffered what appeared to be a nervous breakdown and had expressed his intention to abandon his medical studies and return to Boston. The university president claimed that Patrick had left campus in the early morning hours, taking only his essential belongings and leaving behind a note expressing his regret at disappointing his family. The note, which was never shown to other students or Patrick's family, allegedly contained Patrick's request that the university not contact his parents, as he was too ashamed of his failure to face them. Dr. Walsh assured Thomas and other concerned students that Patrick's decision, while regrettable, was not uncommon among young men who discovered that the realities of medical practice were more challenging than they had anticipated. What made Patrick's disappearance particularly troubling was the response of the Walsh family when his parents arrived at the university 2 weeks later. Frantic with worry after receiving no word from their son, Margaret Walsh met with him in the university's reception hall, her demeanor professional but distant. She repeated the story of Patrick's nervous breakdown and departure. But when his mother asked to see his belongings or the note he had allegedly left, Margaret explained that Patrick had specifically requested that all his possessions be donated to charity, and that his personal effects had already been distributed to needy students. Patrick's father, a dock worker who had sacrificed years of wages to send his son to medical school, became increasingly agitated during the meeting. He insisted that his son would never have left without word, that the boy had been writing home regularly and had expressed nothing but enthusiasm for his studies in his most recent letter. Margaret Walsh remained unmoved, suggesting that young men often conceal their struggles from their families, and that Patrick's breakdown had been sudden and severe. The O'Brien family's attempt to involve local authorities proved futile. Sheriff William Hawkins, who had developed a cordial relationship with the Walsh family and often dined at their home, conducted what he described as a thorough investigation. He interviewed several students, all of whom confirmed that Patrick had seemed troubled in his final days. More significantly, Dr. James Walsh presented the sheriff with detailed medical records showing Patrick's declining performance and documented instances of the young man expressing doubts about his chosen profession. What the sheriff's investigation failed to uncover was far more sinister than a simple case of academic failure. Unknown to anyone outside the Walsh family, Patrick O'Brien had indeed attended the late-night anatomy session on May 15th. However, instead of a review session he had been promised, Patrick had walked into what Dr. James Walsh referred to as a comprehensive practical examination. The young man had been led to a private laboratory in the university's basement, a room that appeared on no architectural plans and was accessible only through a concealed door behind a bookshelf in James Walsh's office. In this hidden chamber, Patrick had been subjected to what James Walsh described as advanced anatomical study, using techniques that a professor claimed were practiced in the finest European medical schools. The procedure involved the administration of a carefully calibrated dose of chloroform, a recently discovered anesthetic that James Walsh had obtained through his connections with European physicians. The chloroform was presented to Patrick as a necessary component of the advanced examination, designed to test his knowledge of anatomy while under the influence of medical gases, a technique that Walsh claimed would prepare him for the realities of surgical practice. What Patrick could not have known was that the dose of chloroform had been calculated not to sedate him for examination, but to kill him slowly and painlessly. James Walsh had spent months perfecting the technique, determining the precise amount needed to cause respiratory failure while leaving no obvious signs of violence. As Patrick lost consciousness, believing he was participating in a legitimate medical procedure, James Walsh began the meticulous process of preserving the young man's body using advanced embalming techniques he had learned during his studies in Edinburgh. The preservation process was a work of macabre artistry. Using a combination of arsenic, mercury, and alcohol-based solutions, James Walsh could maintain a corpse in pristine condition for months, making it virtually indistinguishable from a recently deceased individual. The process involved replacing the body's blood with preservative solutions, carefully injecting the chemicals into major arteries and veins while simultaneously draining the natural fluids. The result was a specimen that retained its natural color and flexibility, making it invaluable for anatomical study. Within days of Patrick's murder, his preserved body was carefully packed in a specially designed shipping container filled with salt and ice. The container was labeled as containing medical specimens and was transported to Baltimore's harbor, where it was loaded onto a ship bound for Edinburgh. The University of Edinburgh, desperate for high-quality anatomical specimens to support their renowned medical program, had agreed to pay the extraordinary sum of $500 for each perfectly preserved body, more than twice the annual salary of most American workers. The success of this first murder established a pattern that would define the Walsh family's operation for the next 35 years. They had discovered that their position as educators gave them access to a steady supply of vulnerable young men, many of whom came from families too poor or too distant to investigate their disappearances thoroughly. More importantly, they had developed a system that allowed them to eliminate these students while maintaining plausible explanations for their absences. The disappearance of Patrick O'Brien marked the beginning of what would become a carefully orchestrated campaign of murder that would claim the lives of 156 young men over the course of more than 3 decades. However, the Walsh family's operation was far from a random series of killings. It was a methodical business enterprise that required careful planning, precise execution, and an intricate web of deception that extended far beyond the walls of St. Thomas Medical University. In the months following Patrick's disappearance, the Walsh family refined their selection process. They identified the characteristics that made students ideal victims. Young men from distant locations whose families had limited resources to investigate their disappearances. Students who were struggling academically and might believably abandon their studies, and particularly those who had few close friendships within the university community. The work-study program that had initially been designed to help poor students afford their education became a hunting ground for the Walsh family's predatory enterprise. Dr. Margaret Walsh, with her position as dean, had access to detailed information about every student's background, financial situation, and family circumstances. She maintained meticulous records that included not only academic performance, but also personal details about each student's family, their ability to pay tuition, and their social connections within the university. Students who met their criteria were gradually drawn into what the Walsh family called advanced study opportunities, special programs that promise additional training, but actually served to isolate potential victims from their peers. The basement laboratory where Patrick O'Brien had met his fate was expanded and improved over the years. James Walsh had created what was essentially a sophisticated killing chamber disguised as a medical facility. The room contained multiple dissection tables, advanced surgical instruments, and an elaborate system for preserving bodies using techniques that were decades ahead of their time. The walls were lined with medical texts and anatomical charts, creating the illusion of a legitimate educational facility while concealing the room's true purpose. The preservation techniques that James Walsh had developed were revolutionary for their time. By combining traditional embalming methods with chemical innovations, he could maintain bodies in perfect condition for months or even years. The process involved multiple stages. First, the careful draining of blood and replacement with preservative solutions. Second, the injection of specialized chemicals into organs and tissues. And finally, the application of external treatments that maintain the body's natural appearance and flexibility. The result was specimens that were superior to anything available to European medical schools at the time. The financial aspects of the operation were managed by Dr. Michael Walsh, who had established relationships with medical schools throughout Europe. Using his credentials and reputation, he had convinced institutions in Edinburgh, London, Paris, and Dublin that St. Thomas Medical University had access to an exceptional supply of fresh cadavers due to their location near several hospitals and their connections with local Catholic parishes. The European schools, desperate for high-quality anatomical specimens and trusting the word of a fellow Catholic physician, agreed to pay premium prices for the preserved bodies. The shipping operation was complex and required careful coordination. Bodies were packed in specially designed containers that appeared to be standard medical supply shipments. The containers were filled with salt, ice, and sawdust to maintain temperature and prevent decomposition during the lengthy ocean voyage. Shipping documents identified the contents as anatomical specimens or medical research materials, and the containers were labeled with the names of legitimate medical institutions. The Walsh family had developed relationships with several shipping companies, and their frequent shipments of medical supplies to Europe became a routine part of Baltimore's maritime commerce. To maintain their cover story, the Walsh family created elaborate documentation for each victim's disappearance. They maintained detailed records of academic performance, disciplinary issues, and personal problems that would support their explanations for why students had left the university. In some cases, they even forged letters from students to their families, explaining their decisions to abandon their studies and seek opportunities elsewhere. These letters, written in James Walsh's careful handwriting, often contained references to personal shame, financial difficulties, or loss of faith in their chosen profession. The local community remained largely unaware of the true nature of the Walsh family's activities. The university's reputation continued to grow, and graduates consistently demonstrated exceptional surgical skills and anatomical knowledge. Local merchants prospered from the business the university brought to the area, and the Walsh family were respected members of the community who contributed generously to local charities and church activities. Sheriff Hawkins, who had investigated several student disappearances over the years, had developed a trusting relationship with the Walsh family and rarely questioned their explanation for students who suddenly departed. The selection of victims followed a carefully planned schedule. The Walsh family typically identified between 4 and 6 students per year who met their criteria. The murders were usually carried out during the winter months when shipping to Europe was less frequent, allowing them to accumulate several preserved bodies before arranging transportation. The timing also coincided with the university's most intense academic periods, when students might believably suffer breakdowns or decide to abandon their studies. By 1810, 12 years after Patrick O'Brien's murder, the Walsh family had killed 43 students and generated over $200,000 in revenue from their European customers. The operation had become so successful that they had begun to expand their facilities and consider increasing their output. However, success also brought new challenges as a growing number of disappearances began to attract attention from sources beyond the local community. The first serious threat to the Walsh family's operation emerged in the spring of 1811 when Father Timothy O'Malley arrived at St. Thomas Medical University to investigate concerns raised by several Irish parishes in Boston and New York. Father O'Malley, a stern and methodical priest who served as an unofficial liaison between Irish Catholic families and educational institutions, had been contacted by more than a dozen families whose sons had supposedly abandoned their medical studies at St. Thomas. What troubled Father Ully was not just the number of cases, but the remarkable similarity in the circumstances of each disappearance. Father O'Malley's investigation began with a careful review of the cases. In each instance, the missing student had been described as struggling academically in the weeks before their disappearance, despite having previously shown strong performance. Each student had supposedly left the university suddenly, often in the middle of the night, without saying goodbye to roommates or close friends. Most disturbing, each family had received a letter from the university explaining their son's departure, but none had received direct communication from the students themselves. When Father O'Malley arrived at St. Thomas, he was greeted warmly by Dr. Michael Walsh, who expressed understanding for the priest's concerns and offered full cooperation with his investigation. Dr. Walsh explained that the pressures of medical education were severe and that many young men from poor families found the academic demands overwhelming. He pointed out that the university's high standards while producing exceptional physicians also resulted in a higher rate of student departures than might be seen at less rigorous institutions. Father O'Malley's interviews with current students revealed a troubling pattern. Several young men mentioned hearing strange sounds from the basement areas of the university late at night, sounds that seemed to come from areas where students were not supposed to be. Others described feeling uneasy about certain advanced study opportunities that were offered to struggling students, though none could articulate exactly what made them uncomfortable. Most significantly, several students mentioned that those who had supposedly left the university had expressed excitement about their studies in their final conversations, making their sudden departures seem out of character. The priest's investigation took a more serious turn when he attempted to verify the university's claims about student departures. When he requested to see the letters that missing students had supposedly left behind, Dr. Margaret Walsh explained that the university's policy was to respect students' privacy and that personal correspondence was not kept in permanent files. When Father O'Malley asked to examine academic records for the missing students, he was shown files that documented declining performance and behavioral problems. But the priest noticed that many of the entries appeared to have been made in similar handwriting and with similar ink, suggesting they might have been created at the same time rather than over the course of several months. Father O'Malley's most disturbing discovery came when he attempted to contact families of students who had supposedly left the university in previous years. Using church records and connections with parishes throughout the Northeast, he was able to locate several families who had never received any communication from their sons after the initial notification from the university. These families had spent years wondering about their son's fate, and many had attempted to locate them through various means, but had never found any trace of the young men. The priest's investigation might have exposed the Walsh family's operation if not for a carefully orchestrated campaign of intimidation and misdirection. Dr. James Walsh, recognizing the threat that Father Ali represented, began spreading rumors about the priest's mental stability and suggesting that his investigation was motivated by personal animosity toward the university. More directly, the Walsh family arranged for Father Ali to receive several anonymous letters warning him that continued investigation would result in serious consequences for his safety and career. The decisive moment came when Father O'Malley demanded to inspect the university's basement facilities, claiming he had reason to believe that students were being held against their will. Jure Michael Walsh initially refused, citing medical safety concerns and the need to protect ongoing research projects. However, when Father Ali threatened to involve civil authorities, Walsh agreed to a limited inspection of selected areas. The inspection was carefully choreographed. Father Ali was shown several basement rooms that contained legitimate medical equipment and supplies, including a properly equipped anatomy laboratory with several cadavers that had been obtained through legal means. Dr. James Walsh provided detailed explanations of the university's anatomical curriculum and demonstrated various preservation techniques that he claimed were standard in European medical schools. What Father O'Malley was not shown was a concealed laboratory behind the bookshelf in James Walsh's office where the actual murders and preservation work took place. Father Ali's investigation concluded without definitive proof of wrongdoing, but the priest left St. Thomas with serious concerns about the university's operations. He submitted a report to Catholic authorities in Baltimore recommending closer oversight of the institution and suggesting that the high rate of student departures warranted further investigation. However, the Walsh family's reputation and their connections within the Catholic medical community ensured that Father Ali's concerns were not pursued with the vigor they deserved. The near exposure of their operation forced the Walsh family to make several significant changes to their methods. They reduced the number of victims per year from an average of 6 to 4, spacing the disappearances more widely and creating more elaborate cover stories for each case. They also began selecting victims from more distant locations, making it even more difficult for families to investigate their sons' disappearances. Most importantly, they established a network of informants within the local community who would alert them to any future investigations or suspicious inquiries. The Walsh family also began to diversify their operation, establishing relationships with medical schools in other countries and exploring opportunities to expand their market for preserved bodies. By 1815, They were shipping specimens not only to Europe, but also to medical institutions in South America and the Caribbean. The expanded market allowed them to increase their prices and become more selective about the quality of their specimens, focusing on younger, healthier victims who would produce superior preserved bodies. By 1820, the Walsh family's operation had evolved into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that generated enormous profits while maintaining a veneer of academic respectability. However, their success had also attracted the attention of competitors and created vulnerabilities that would eventually threaten their entire operation. The medical preservation techniques that had made them wealthy had also made them famous within European medical circles, and their reputation for producing exceptional anatomical specimens had begun to raise questions about their methods. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a German physician who had purchased several specimens from St. Thomas Medical University, arrived in Baltimore in the autumn of 1820 to investigate the source of what he considered the finest preserved bodies he had ever encountered. Zimmermann, who taught anatomy at the University of Heidelberg, had been using specimens from St. Thomas for 2 years and had become curious about the techniques that produced such remarkable results. He had written to Dr. James Walsh requesting permission to observe the preservation process, ostensibly to learn methods that he could apply in his own wake. The arrival of Dr. Zimmermann created a crisis for the Walsh family. They could not allow him to observe their actual preservation techniques, as this would expose the fact that they were working with freshly killed bodies rather than naturally deceased individuals. At the same time, they could not afford to alienate a customer who had paid them over $15,000 for specimens and had connections with medical schools throughout Europe. The Walsh family decided to create an elaborate deception that would satisfy Zimmermann's curiosity while concealing their true methods. Dr. James Walsh prepared a demonstration using a cadaver that had been obtained through legitimate means. The body of an elderly man who had died of natural causes and had been donated to the university by his family. The demonstration took place in the legitimate anatomy laboratory, and Walsh explained his preservation techniques using a combination of real methods and fictional innovations. He claimed that the exceptional quality of his specimens was due to the unique climate of Western Maryland and his access to recently deceased individuals through partnerships with local hospitals and Catholic parishes. Dr. Zimmermann was initially impressed by the demonstration, but his trained eye quickly identified inconsistencies in Walsh's explanations. The preservation techniques that Walsh demonstrated could not possibly produce the results that Zimmermann had observed in the specimens he had purchased. The bodies he had received from St. Thomas showed none of the typical signs of decomposition that would be present in individuals who had died of natural causes, and the quality of preservation was far superior to anything that could be achieved using the methods Walsh was demonstrating. When Zimmermann pressed Walsh for more detailed explanations, the American physician became evasive and suggested that certain aspects of his techniques were proprietary secrets that he could not share. This response only heightened Zimmermann's suspicions, and he began to investigate the university's operations more thoroughly. He interviewed students and examined facilities, looking for evidence of the advanced techniques that would be necessary to produce the remarkable specimens he had purchased. Zimmermann's investigation led him to make a disturbing discovery. While examining the shipping records at Baltimore's harbor, he found documentation showing that St. Thomas Medical University had shipped over 200 preserved bodies to European institutions over the previous 20 years. This number seemed impossible for a small medical school, even one with connections to local hospitals and parishes. More troubling, the shipping record showed that the preserved bodies were being sent to institutions that had no record of ordering specimens from St. Thomas. The German physician's investigation might have exposed the Walsh family's operation if not for the intervention of Dr. Michael Walsh, who recognized the threat that Zimmermann represented and acted decisively to eliminate it. On the night of October 15, 1820, Dr. Zimmermann was invited to attend a special evening demonstration of advanced preservation techniques in the university's basement laboratory. He was told that Walsh had decided to share his most closely guarded secrets and that the demonstration would provide answers to all of his questions. Dr. Zimmermann arrived at the laboratory at 9 o'clock that evening, expecting to observe the advanced techniques that had produced the exceptional specimens he had purchased. Instead, he found himself facing the same fate that had befallen 156 medical students over the previous 22 years. The German physician was administered a carefully calculated dose of chloroform, ostensibly to demonstrate the use of anesthetics in anatomical study, but actually to kill him slowly and painlessly. The murder of Dr. Zimmerman marked a significant escalation in the Walsh family's criminal activities. Unlike the medical students who had been their previous victims, Zimmerman was a respected physician with connections throughout European medical communities. His disappearance would be investigated more thoroughly, and his failure to return to Germany would raise questions that could not be easily dismissed. To cover their tracks, the Walsh family created an elaborate story about Zimmerman's departure. They claimed that the German physician had been called back to Europe suddenly due to a family emergency and had left Baltimore on short notice. They produced forged documents showing that Zimmerman had booked passage on a ship bound for Hamburg, and they arranged for witnesses who would testify that they had seen the German physician at the harbor on the day of his supposed departure. The preservation of Dr. Zimmerman's body presented unique challenges. Unlike the young medical students who had been their typical victims, Zimmerman was older and his body showed signs of the diseases and injuries that came with age. James Walsh had to use more advanced techniques to restore the body to a condition that would be acceptable to European buyers. The process took several weeks and required the use of experimental chemicals that Walsh had been developing to improve the quality of his specimens. The German physician's preserved body was eventually shipped to the University of Edinburgh, where it was received as part of a routine order for anatomical specimens. The irony was not lost on James Walsh. Dr. Zimmerman's body would be dissected by the same medical students who had been studying the bodies of his previous victims. The preserved corpse was of such exceptional quality that it was used for advanced surgical demonstrations and was praised by Edinburgh's faculty as one of the finest specimens they had ever received. The success of the Zimmerman murder convinced the Walsh family that they could eliminate any threat to their operation regardless of the victim's status or connections. This confidence would prove to be their undoing as it led them to take increasingly dangerous risks and to underestimate the determination of those who sought to expose their crimes. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in St. Thomas intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of medical murder and greed. The beginning of the end for the Walsh family's murderous enterprise came from an unexpected source, one of their own victims. In the spring of 1834, Thomas Mackenzie, Patrick O'Brien's former roommate and one of the few people who had questioned his friend's mysterious disappearance 35 years earlier, had become a successful physician in Philadelphia. Mackenzie had never forgotten the strange circumstances of Patrick's departure from St. Thomas, and over the years, he had quietly investigated the fates of other students who had supposedly left the university under similar circumstances. Mackenzie's investigation had led him to a disturbing pattern. Through his connections with Catholic parishes throughout the Northeast, he had identified over 40 families whose sons had supposedly abandoned their medical studies at St. Thomas, but had never been heard from again. These families had spent decades wondering about their sons' fates, and many had attempted to locate them through various means, but had never found any trace of the young men. The breakthrough in Mackenzie's investigation came when he encountered Dr. Wilhelm Schneider, a German physician who had studied at the University of Edinburgh and had become curious about the exceptional quality of anatomical specimens that the Scottish institution had been receiving from an American medical school. Schneider had examined dozens of preserved bodies that had been shipped from St. Tew's Medical University, and he had noticed several disturbing patterns. The first pattern was a remarkable consistency in the quality of preservation. Every specimen from St. Thomas showed the same exceptional level of preservation with no signs of decomposition or damage that would typically be present in naturally deceased individuals. The preservation techniques used were clearly superior to anything available in Europe at the time, suggesting access to methods that were not widely known or practiced. The second pattern was the demographic consistency of the specimens. Nearly all the bodies were young men between the ages of 18 and 25. All appeared to have been in excellent health at the time of death, and none showed signs of diseases or injuries that would typically cause death in young adults. This was statistically impossible if the specimens were from naturally deceased individuals, as young men of that age would normally die from accidents, violence, or acute diseases that would leave visible marks on their bodies. The third and most disturbing pattern was the apparent cause of death of Schneider's careful examinations had revealed that many of the specimens showed signs of respiratory failure, without any underlying disease or injury that would explain such a death. The lungs and respiratory systems appeared normal, but the pattern of cellular damage suggested that the individuals had died from asphyxiation or respiratory depression, possibly caused by chemical substances. When Schneider shared his findings with Mackenzie, the American physician realized that he had discovered evidence of a systematic program of murder. The two men began a comprehensive investigation that would ultimately expose the Walsh family's crimes and bring their 36-year reign of terror to an end. Mackenzie and Schneider's investigation focused on the shipping records from Baltimore's harbor, which showed that St. Thomas Medical University had shipped over 400 preserved bodies to European institutions between 1798 and 1834. This number was impossible for a legitimate medical school, even one with connections to hospitals and local parishes. More significantly, the shipping record showed that the preserved bodies were being sent to institutions throughout Europe, creating a distribution network that was far too extensive for a small American medical school. The two physicians decided to confront the Walsh family directly. In July 1834, Mackenzie and Schneider arrived at St. Thomas Medical University, claiming to be investigating advanced preservation techniques on behalf of European medical institutions. They requested a comprehensive tour of the university facilities and asked to observe the preservation process that had produced such exceptional specimens. The arrival of Mackenzie and Schneider created a crisis for the Walsh family. They recognized Mackenzie as Patrick O'Brien's former roommate and realized that his investigation posed a direct threat to their operation. At the same time, they could not simply refuse to cooperate with the investigators, as this would raise suspicions that could lead to a broader investigation by civil authorities. Dr. Michael Walsh decided to eliminate the threat that Mackenzie and Schneider represented. He invited both men to attend a special evening demonstration of advanced preservation techniques in the university's basement laboratory, telling them that he had decided to share his most closely guarded secrets. The demonstration was scheduled for the night of July 23, 1834, and Walsh assured his visitors that they would finally receive answers to all their questions. However, Mackenzie and Schneider had anticipated that the Walsh family might attempt to harm them. Before arriving at the university, they had shared their findings with authorities in Philadelphia and Baltimore, and they had arranged for colleagues to investigate their disappearances if they failed to return from their visit to St. Thomas. More importantly, they had hidden detailed documentation of their investigation in multiple locations, ensuring that their evidence would survive even if they did not. The confrontation in the basement laboratory was swift and decisive. When Mackenzie and Schneider arrived for the supposed demonstration, they found themselves facing Dr. James Walsh and two assistants in a concealed laboratory where 156 young men had been murdered over the previous 36 years. The room contained multiple dissection tables, advanced surgical instruments, and clear evidence of the systematic murder and preservation of human beings. Dr. James Walsh attempted to administer chloroform to both investigators using the same technique that had killed Patrick O'Brien and dozens of other victims. However, Mackenzie and Schneider were prepared for this possibility and had brought their own weapons. The confrontation that followed was violent and chaotic, resulting in the death of Dr. James Walsh and the serious injury of both investigators. The gunshot that killed Dr. James Walsh was heard throughout the university, bringing students and faculty running to investigate. What they found in the concealed laboratory was a scene of horror that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The room contained evidence of decades of systematic murder, including preserved body parts, surgical instruments stained with blood, and detailed records of the victims and the European institutions that had purchased their preserved bodies. The investigation that followed the confrontation in the laboratory revealed the full scope of the Walsh family's crimes. Authorities found detailed records showing that 156 young men had been murdered at St. Thomas Medical University between 1798 and 1834, and that their preserved bodies had been sold to European medical institutions for a total of over $800,000. The records also showed that the operation had been carefully planned and executed, with the Walsh family maintaining detailed information about each victim and each sale. The aftermath of the discovery at St. Thomas Medical University sent shock waves through the medical communities of both America and Europe. The revelation that a respected Catholic medical school had been systematically murdering students for profit challenged fundamental assumptions about medical education and the integrity of academic institutions. The investigation that followed would expose corruption and complicity that reached far beyond the Walsh family and would forever change how medical schools obtained and used anatomical specimens. Dr. Michael Walsh and his wife Margaret were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and fraud. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational criminal proceedings in American history, drawing attention from across the nation and Europe. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of the systematic murders, including the detailed records that James Walsh had meticulously maintained of each victim and each transaction with European medical schools. The defense attempted to argue that the Walsh family had been driven to their crimes by the impossible demands of medical education and the lack of legal sources for anatomical specimens. They claimed that the murders were mercy killings designed to spare struggling students from the shame of academic failure, while simultaneously advancing medical knowledge through the donation of their bodies to science. This argument was quickly demolished by the prosecution's evidence showing the enormous profits the family had generated from their crimes. Margaret Walsh proved to be the most defiant of the defendants. During her testimony, she showed no remorse for the murders, instead expressing pride in the quality of medical education that St. Thomas had provided and the contributions that preserved specimens had made to European medical knowledge. She claimed that the young men who had died had achieved a form of immortality through their service to medical science, and that their deaths had ultimately saved more lives than they had taken by advancing surgical techniques and anatomical understanding. The trial revealed disturbing details about the selection and murder of victims. The prosecution presented evidence showing that the Walsh family had specifically targeted students from poor families who would be unable to investigate their sons' disappearances. They had maintained detailed psychological profiles of potential victims, identifying young men who were socially isolated or struggling with homesickness, making them easier to manipulate and less likely to be missed by their peers. The testimony of surviving students painted a picture of a university where fear and suspicion had become commonplace. Many students described feeling uneasy about certain faculty members and avoiding situations where they might be alone with university officials. Several testified that they had heard disturbing sounds from basement areas of the university, but had been too frightened to investigate. The atmosphere of terror that the Walsh family had created extended far beyond their actual victims to encompass the entire student body. The international implications of the case were equally shocking. The investigation revealed that prestigious medical institutions throughout Europe had been unknowingly purchasing the bodies of murder victims for over 3 decades. The University of Edinburgh, the University of Paris, the Royal College of Surgeons in London, and dozens of other institutions were forced to confront the fact that their anatomical collections contained the preserved bodies of young Americans who had been killed specifically for their medical value. The European response was swift and decisive. Medical schools throughout the continent implemented new policies requiring detailed documentation of the sources of anatomical specimens. Many institutions conducted comprehensive reviews of their collections, attempting to identify specimens that might have come from St. Thomas Medical University. Several schools held memorial services for the unknown victims whose bodies had been used for medical education without their consent. The financial investigation revealed the enormous scope of the Walsh family's profits. Over 36 years, they had generated more than $800,000 from the sale of preserved bodies, a sum that would equal approximately $25 million in today's currency. The money had been invested in properties throughout Maryland and Virginia, in shipping companies that had transported their gruesome cargo, and in European banks that had facilitated their international transactions. The trial concluded in November 1834 with the conviction of both Michael and Margaret Walsh on all charges. They were sentenced to death by hanging, making them among the first Americans to be executed for crimes related to medical education. The sentences were carried out on December 15, 1834, before a crowd of over 3,000 spectators who had gathered to witness the end of America's most notorious medical murder case. The fate of the victims' families became a central focus of public attention following the convictions. Many of the families had spent decades wondering about their sons' disappearances, and the revelation of the truth brought a mixture of relief and horror. Some families sued the Walsh estate for damages, while others focused on ensuring that their sons received proper burial. The identification of victims proved challenging as many of the preserved bodies had been shipped to Europe years earlier, and their current locations were unknown. St. Thomas Medical University was permanently closed following the discovery of the murders. The building was eventually demolished, and the land was sold to a farming family who were unaware of its dark history. Local residents reported that the site remained cursed with strange sounds and unexplained phenomena occurring for years after the building's destruction. Whether these reports reflected genuine supernatural activity or simply the psychological impact of the horrific crimes that had occurred there remains a matter of speculation. The impact on medical education in America was profound and lasting. The Walsh case led to the establishment of strict regulations governing the procurement and use of anatomical specimens in medical schools. Institutions were required to maintain detailed records of the sources of their cadavers and to ensure that all specimens were obtained through legal means. The case also sparked a broader conversation about the ethics of medical education and the responsibilities of educators to protect their students. The international medical community was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the demand for anatomical specimens and the pressure this demand placed on medical schools to find sources for cadavers. The high prices that European institutions had been willing to pay for preserved bodies had created a market that encouraged criminal activity. As a result, medical schools throughout Europe and America began developing alternative methods for teaching anatomy, including the use of artificial models and more limited use of cadaveros. The psychological impact on the medical profession was equally significant. Physicians who had trained at institutions that used specimens from St. Thomas were forced to confront the possibility that their education had been built on murder. Many doctors reported feeling haunted by the knowledge that their surgical skills might have been developed through the study of murder victims. Some physicians left the profession entirely, unable to reconcile their commitment to healing with their unwitting participation in the Walsh family's crimes. The case also had broader implications for American society's trust in educational institutions. The revelation that a respected Catholic medical school had been systematically murdering students for profit challenged fundamental assumptions about the integrity of academic institutions and the safety of higher education. Parents throughout the country began questioning the safety of sending their children to distant schools, and many institutions implemented new policies designed to ensure better communication with students' families. The documentation discovered in the Walsh family's hidden laboratory provided historians with an unprecedented window into the operation of a systematic murder enterprise. The detailed records they had maintained included not only information about their victims, but also correspondence with European medical schools, financial records of their transactions, and technical notes about their preservation techniques. This documentation became crucial evidence in understanding how such a massive criminal operation could have continued undetected for over 3 decades. The preservation techniques that James Walsh had developed were studied by forensic experts and medical professionals who were amazed by their sophistication and effectiveness. While the techniques had been used for horrific purposes, they represented genuine advances in anatomical preservation that were decades ahead of their time. Some of the methods that Walsh had developed were eventually adopted by legitimate medical institutions, though their connection to the murders ensured that they were always associated with the dark history of St. Thomas Medical University. The investigation also revealed the extent to which the Walsh family had corrupted local officials and community leaders. Sheriff William Hawkins, who had investigated several student disappearances over the years, was found to have accepted significant payments from the Walsh family in exchange for limiting his investigations. Several local businessmen who had facilitated the shipping of preserved bodies to Europe were charged as accessories to murder, though most received relatively light sentences in exchange for their cooperation with authorities. The religious implications of the case were particularly troubling for the Catholic community. The fact that the crimes had been committed at a Catholic institution by individuals who had presented themselves as devout Catholics challenged the Church's ability to police its own institutions. The Catholic hierarchy in America implemented new oversight procedures for Catholic educational institutions and required more frequent inspections of facilities and financial records. The European medical schools that had purchased specimens from St. Thomas faced their own reckonings. Many institutions conducted comprehensive investigations of their specimen acquisition practices and implemented new policies to ensure that they were not unknowingly purchasing the bodies of murder victims. The financial losses were significant, as institutions had paid premium prices for specimens that turned out to be the products of criminal activity. The families of the 156 victims became the focus of a national fundraising effort designed to provide them with some measure of compensation for their losses. While no amount of money could restore their sons or ease their decades of uncertainty, the funds helped many families pay for memorial services and provided some financial support to those who had been impoverished by their attempts to investigate their sons' disappearances. The case established important legal precedents for the prosecution of crimes related to medical education and the international trafficking of human remains. The Walsh convictions were among the first in American history to address the systematic murder of individuals for commercial purposes, and the international scope of the case led to new treaties governing the trade in anatomical specimens between countries. This mystery shows us the devastating consequences of unchecked ambition and the corruption of institutions meant to protect and educate. The Walsh family's crimes remind us that evil can flourish even in the most respected institutions when greed overcomes humanity and when oversight fails. What do you think of this story? Subscribe to the Fear Ledger, where every story uncovers a secret history they tried to bury. See you in the next video.